You're here today in a third of a series on how to do MHPSS training online. We are recording 3 different sessions. The first one is Practice What You Preach, where we cover all the practicalities and interaction that can take place in an MHPSS training to make it engaging and participatory. Second episode covered how to plan a training. It was actually called Planning the Planning because there's a lot of planning that goes into an online training. And today we are looking at what it takes to transform a longer MHPSS training into an online format. I am Susanna Kasha from the Reference Center for Psychosocial Support. And today my co-facilitator is Shona, Design and Technology Facilitator, who's waving at us. Shona is the one that helped us transform or take the leap into the digital world. We are also having a lot of facilitators here. Kelly McBride, PS Center Technical Advisor, so is Michelle Engels, another PS Center Technical Advisor, and Sarah Harrison, third Technical Advisor. And we have some participants, and I'm going to ask you to present yourself in a little while. Before I do that, I'll just say that everybody has consented to being on camera, to be recorded, to be on video, and everybody is aware that we don't share more than we should because of confidentiality issues. So we don't share personal information, private information, that is.
Now we're going to transition into just asking our amazing guests about their experiences of conducting these online trainings that they have. Kelly, would you be so kind as to tell us about your experience, a little bit about the context of PM Plus, like what is PM Plus, and tell us about what is the intensity of the training?
Yeah, so Problem Management Plus is a manualized intervention that's meant to be scalable. So it can be kind of used and picked up by individuals who don't have mental health backgrounds. And so it's, based upon evidence-based kind of therapeutic interventions, but kind of, I guess, presented in a way that's a little bit more digestible and usable by a variety of different people. And so the training that we engaged in, so we translated the training of helpers. So these are people who would go off and do the one-on-one kind of support. So we translated what would normally be a face-to-face training into a virtual training. And so it's pretty intensive, and it's intensive if you're doing it face-to-face. It's usually about an 80-hour training that can be adjusted depending on kind of the skills and background of the individuals participating. But when we sort of went upon the journey of translating to virtual, we decided to keep it at around that 80-hour mark, just because we weren't really sure how it was going to kind of pan out. And I'm always surprised by these things because at the end of 80 hours, you're like, can we have a few more days? There's actually more we'd like to go through. But we've used kind of a combination, a blended learning style where we're face-to-face on Zoom, doing lots of different activities together, using different platforms like Mural. And then there's offline stuff. So there's YouTube videos that you can watch that have demonstrations of sessions. We used recording so that people could record themselves doing role plays and things like that. And then a huge part of the training is about getting that experience. So one of the key things that we did was role plays. And the cohorts that I worked with, we found that people really preferred to do their role plays together on Zoom. So going into breakout sessions and having that space to practice being both a helper and being a client or a beneficiary or service user. And then being able to learn from one another. And then as a trainer, you kind of float around between breakout rooms with your camera off and your microphone off and observe. And then you're able to give really kind of personalized feedback. So the trainings that I've been involved in, they're usually a full 10 days. We'll have a weekend in between. And they're pretty long, all right? So they're pretty heavy days, looking at about 8 hours of engagement with PM Plus, whether directly on the screen or offline activities that you're doing. So pretty involved, pretty heavy stuff, but we also try to lighten it up a little bit so that it doesn't feel incredibly painful.
Thank you. That was a lot of insight into the process. And actually, as one of the first people in the PS Center to take that digital leap, what were the thoughts behind your mind, or the assumptions you have, the frustrations you had in the process?
Well, my first thought was, oh gosh, I don't think we can do this. I didn't know how it was going to work out. Literally had no real faith in the process. And Adam, you can attest to this. Like, we had conversations about, we have to be able to tell each other if this isn't working and pull the plug. I was pleasantly surprised when we figured out it could work, but wasn't always easy, especially in the first days of kind of building relationship. And I think, Michelle, you mentioned that, like, how do I build a relationship over this virtual world with people I've never met who are across the ocean? And how do we work together to make sure that this is working for all of us? And that was a pretty steep learning curve, but a really important one, to just remember to take the time to connect with the humans across the screen, and take that time to really figure out how people like to learn and how they like to engage. PM Plus is very manualized. There's a trainer's manual that can literally tell you word for word what to do. And with translating to a virtual space, you really have to not abandon that, but be ready and be prepared to shift from that, and to have creative ideas about how to engage people and how to train people. So there's a lot of preparation involved. There's a lot of thinking pretty quick on your feet as well, I'd say. And some days you have a plan and then you just throw it out the window and you start from scratch.
Thank you. And Adam, actually, I was going to ask you from the organizer's side, for someone who brought PM Plus into their space, could you tell us a little bit about what are the concerns or assumptions that you had?
I was wondering if I could just build a little bit on what Kelly was saying. I mean, I think there were two things that emerged during the experience that, in hindsight, I think really helped to transform it to the success that it was, because it wasn't without challenges, but it really was that flexibility and openness that I think was just so important in figuring out how to sustain the engagement. And for me, that came in two ways. First, Shona, your structure that you provided, where when the participants, when the helpers, I think, often felt very pulled in many directions, they had the consistency of the emails and the technology to support them every day. And whether they knew that or not, there was that expectation that they would continue to get the emails from you, the lessons from you, and that helped tremendously. And then this will always be, I think, in my mind, the most pivotal moment where, in trainings, you have to really connect with the rationale for why are we doing this? And it was a pandemic. Black Lives Matter protests were just starting in the US. George Floyd had just been murdered. And I think my students were pretty burnt out from their semester. And of course, there was this question of, like, why should we be doing this? And at that point, Kelly took a big, bold leap and spoke from a very vulnerable place about her own doubts and her own skepticism about the training, which led to a little bit of a detour. But I think that really brought us together in a way where they understood that this was not just being something imposed on them, but that the trainers also had to struggle with and think through when they went through it themselves. But I thought it was that conversation that kind of moved us into a much more productive way. But had Kelly just insisted on, let's just get through the material, I don't think it would have worked. I think she really had to take that chance. And it was a little scary, but in the end, there was such a payoff. I think everyone really respected her willingness to take that time to connect with them, with the concerns that they had. And it's something that is definitely going to stick with me in terms of future trainings.
Really appreciate that, Adam. And Kelly, in light of that, I know that in terms of the structure of the training, you made some massive changes to the structure and it really came out pretty well. Could you talk a little bit about how structurally and from a context point of view, the changes happened to adapt it to a digital training?
Sure. And I think, Shona, you can probably speak to this better than anyone. Shona and I had many late my nights into the day with you not having slept for the night before. We had a lot of time together to continuously sort of adjust. And And the way that things evolved, they were very rudimentary, and they were very rudimentary before I met Shona. And so she and I connected a couple of days before the training, but before that, it was just going to kind of be Google Docs, and we all kind of, collaborate in that space. But Shona really, came in and just had amazing ideas of how do we create these collaborative spaces. And so kind of day by day, we would start to evolve things. And so including these collaborative spaces like on Mural, these were changes that would happen along the way. So in the beginning, there's a little bit of that frustration that participants can sometimes have learning a new technology. But as they got more comfortable, Shona and I would then kind of build out new templates so that they could use them within the sessions that they were conducting, and so that it would be something that was more meaningful to them. And that was all based on the feedback that they were giving us in real time. And same goes for, different things like videos, to learn, or different exercises. So some of the offline, for the first time we did a training, there was about a 50-50 of direct online engagement and then offline engagement. The group that we trained first off hated the offline stuff. They're like, this feels like busy work. This feels like homework. I've got 1,000 other things to do. There's a pandemic. The sky is falling. I don't have time for this. And so we really worked to just shave out everything that wasn't necessary or that would bring something to their kind of enrichment and growth. We just took it out. And we found different ways, to make certain things, like view a video on a session while you're making dinner. Like, don't feel like you have to sit there and take notes, but trying to make it real and realistic. And that's, I feel like for every training I've done virtually, there's that constant renegotiation of exercises and things that you're doing. And it takes a ton of energy and preparation, but I think most of the evolution Shona and I made when we worked together has been based upon the feedback of participants and then changes that happen in real time, more or less.
Perfect, thank you. And I can talk a little bit about the technology piece at a little later in the conversation, but definitely I wanted to understand the, an 8-hour training, which is 80 hours training, you did shorten the time in terms of structure. So could you give us a little bit into the learning part of that? How did you manage and structure that?
So for the actual learning bits, we kind of go into each day, and PM Plus is nice because it's, you've got your sessions, it's all kind of dictated to you, and there's different strategies that you want to learn and you want to teach. So a lot of the learning, or a lot of the days had themes. And so there would always be a bit of a participatory bit where we could engage with the kind of theory behind things. And then there would be practice, so role plays, so going into those breakout rooms and practicing. Something we also found to be really helpful, or kind of, and Michelle and I did this in our training, is one of us playing the service user and then the whole group being the helpers. So kind of fun interactive things like that. But for PM Plus, things were really kind of structured around the different sessions or the different strategies, and then the themes around that. But we've changed things up a lot because it gets boring staring at the screen all day long for hours and hours and hours. So I'd say every 30 to 40 minutes, we were shifting the modality of what we're doing. So not too much lecture. So right now, the amount that I've been talking at you guys is already a bit more than I think I would prefer in a training situation. So there'd be a bit of blah, blah, but then go over to Mural and people would collaborate, and then come back and share back, and then go into a breakout room and practice, and then come back. And then I don't want to go through this without highlighting the importance for sort of self-care and reflection as well. So we tried to always make sure that there was space within to reflect on the material, to reflect on how we're doing, to remember that we're human beings with lives outside of the training space. So that was also kind of a big priority for us as we went. Hope that answered your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Kelly, for giving us so much insight into that process. And Michelle, actually, could you tell us about the open role plays that Kelly just mentioned? Because they were really interesting to see how it came into place. It was not initially designed, and it just evolved. And could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was really us kind of thinking on our feet and trying to find a way to kind of make things work. And it happened because we had some pre-recorded role plays that people were often viewing as part of their offline activities. But there were some things that we also wanted to role play in front of them to show them the skills, and so that we can use different types of learning styles. And so initially we were doing an assessment session, and I was supposed to be the assessor asking questions to Kelly. And we really were concerned that people were not going to listen to that at all, because assessments are quite long. The PM Plus assessment is very, very lengthy, lots of questions. And really, if you're not paying attention, you're going to miss a lot of those nuances. So we decided that what we do is do it slightly different, and we gave people forewarning. So we let them know that you're going to be called on to actually start leading the role play. You'll jump into the role of the assessor. So we kind of set the role play up for them. We introduced and we showed an example of a couple of questions being asked. And then randomly, we just called people on the spot. And you could really see the ones that were not paying attention, because then they'd go, oh, what question are we on? And after a couple of times of that, everyone was paying attention and everyone was following along. And so it was just a nice way. I'm sure it was quite tough on them probably initially, but it also helped to set that standard of really being actively engaged during these role plays. And so then actually people gave us feedback and said that they really liked it. Even though they felt quite put on the spot, they actually got a lot out of it, and they were actually being engaged and really paying attention. So they requested that we do more role plays like that rather than going just in breakout rooms and practicing in triads. They decided that they would like a full group role play. And it was really nice because someone would take the lead, and then if they got a bit stuck, we would just open it up and say, does someone want to take over and help out, or does someone have an idea of different questions they could ask? And it really helped to kind of get everyone involved. And I think it worked quite well. It was really nice to see it done in that group setting.
Definitely. Thank you, Michelle. And Viviana has a question for us.
Yeah, I think, Michelle, thank you. You partially answered, because it was about saying, well, what happened with that calling on the spot, because it could go, not online, but I mean, previous experience, it could go terribly wrong depending on what culture you're working with and how people react and what age group and sort of people and roles, day job roles, if the volunteers you're working with, you can lose some. So if you had some strategies to just save the day if that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something we were concerned about. And I should say it definitely wasn't something that we did on the first day of training. By that stage, when we were doing this, we had already kind of got a good sense of them. We had let them know as well, right from the outset. Actually, even before the first day of training, we had a pre-training meeting where we told them this is going to be very participatory. Just be prepared to be doing pretty much 80% of the talking. We're going to do 20%, if that. So they kind of came into the training knowing that that would be the setup. And then when we introduced the role play, we told them, so what's going to happen is I'm going to start off. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then I'm going to hand over to you at random. So be prepared, follow along in your books, because you will be called on. And so that advance warning was important. But I think as well, we really tried to set up a safe space within the training in general, because people are trying out new skills and it can be really anxiety provoking. Even as trainers, it can be really tough to kind of put yourself out there and role play different skills in front of a whole group of people. So we tried to create a really safe space, and we let people know that, okay, we're all going to make mistakes, trainers included. Safe space to do that. This is how we practice. This is how we learn. And I think that makes a big difference. People then feel encouraged to try. And if they don't get it 100% right, I mean, that's okay. That's all part of the learning process. So I think it's how you set it up.
Thank you, Michelle. And I hope that provided a lot of insight to Viviana on the process. And I'd like to ask Sarah a little bit about the cultural adaptation that she has been doing, because you worked with SOS and then you adapted it to their culture while you were conducting the sessions. So could you talk a little bit about that?
So for the SOS Children's Villages one, it was a little bit different to how it was done with the cohort with Adam and that Kelly led on in New York, because they're a little bit more homogenous. So the SOS Children's Villages training I did, where there were, again, it was 10 days, but there were 8 national associations, I think, Sarah, if that's correct. So, or 6. Okay, so there were a group that were based in Africa, and then there was some participants that were coming from Europe, so from Sweden and from Greece and then from Italy. So quite a mixed group, and then we also had it across 6 different time zones as well. So the training happened afternoon, my time, in Central European time, which was early morning for Shona, and then for some participants it was kind of 3 o'clock in the afternoon their day through until the evening, the early evening for them. And that happened in the pre-training time. So it's not really a cultural adaptation, it's just a time zone adaptation. But we had that discussion in the pre-training meeting, what time zone is optimal for everyone and is going to fit, given the breadth of participants that we have. And then we also had to change some of the pictures actually that were being used in previous, where we had done some PowerPoint slides or just agendas for the day that we were able to build from the work that Kelly had done on the new school training. We ended up changing a lot of the pictures to make them much more specific, particularly to the African context as well, so that the pictures are more relatable. Some of the handouts we changed as well in the PM Plus manual to make them more relatable when we put them on the Miro board. Again, having much more African style drawings, for example, as well in the handouts. And then it was a lot of discussions about how PM Plus would be plugged into the ongoing programs that they would be doing or that they are doing within their national association. And that's quite a bit of adaptation because everyone is different, and who they could potentially do it with in terms of clients as well. And then we were able to pair, when it came to the kind of role plays and breakout rooms, we were able to put people in pairs. Kind of probably 60% were from people from the same country. So we had, for example, two people from Rwanda joining, we had 3 from Somalia, but we were able to put them together and so that they could do role plays within the same country. And that was also purposeful, so that after the training happened, it was a way of creating a bit of a peer support and a buddy system, because it meant that within that national association, there were then 2 people trained that could support each other, and was important for intervision and other reasons as well. It didn't work out perfectly because then we had South Africa with Sweden, but but I mean, and then we did the colleagues from Italy, 2 Francescas, so it was very easy remembering their names. They were able to actually do their role plays in Italian in some cases, which they found much easier. And our colleagues from Nigeria were also doing it in Pidgin, which was just easier because it's how they would be doing it when they were in real life. And that then, so some of their role plays enabled them to work out how they would communicate, like basic helping skills. How would I say that in my own language, for example, as well. I'm sure I probably missed something.
No, actually, it's I'm taking over this cluster of questions, and I'd like for you, Sarah, also to talk about that during the training, not only the adaptation, also like Kelly said, the adaptation when the process was interrupted because people were thinking, they had different concerns, and you're talking about how to adapt it. And you also did some role plays that you adapted to the local context, I believe. So people made their own role plays, as far as I know, right? Could you expand on that, please?
So when they went out into the breakout rooms, so when they were practicing role plays, they were, it was them based upon, they thought up the role of, one of them was playing the role of a client and one of them was playing the role of being a helper or a SOS staff member or Red Cross volunteer. But who that person was in terms of personality and characteristics, that was completely up to them. Mm-hmm. And they did make it then specific to their particular context. So the client person, for example, that were in the group from Italy was quite different to who they were having in Somalia and in Rwanda and Burundi, for example. Good. As well.
Yeah, another example of how it was adapted. I think that's really useful for us.
But that was also, it was free. We gave them the freedom to do that, because in my head as a trainer, I couldn't work out giving the instructions for role plays and then working out, okay, I actually have to give 7 different instructions for 7 different contexts. It's just ridiculous. So it's just easier giving them the the freedom within, this is your boundaries, this is what you have to go and do it, rather than being too prescriptive.
Yeah.
I think.
Good. And we have we also want to touch upon there seems to be a massive amount of documentation that's needed in a PM Plus training. So could you tell us a bit about that? That's different from the other trainings that we have also conducted at the PS Center that are less manualized or not manualized at all.
Yeah, because it's manualized. I mean, in a way, it's a nice thing. You have the actual participant manual, which is the intervention itself, and then you also have the trainer's manual. And so you're kind of flicking back and forth through both of them. And then when we were doing it online, Kelly had very helpfully created an online version of the training manual, which was then fully adapted to the online training. So it rejigged the activities and changed them and adapted it. And yeah, sometimes it was quite complicated because, you know, we had the training manual, which we were working off, and we would have that on our screens. And I also like things in hard copy. So I had that in paper next to me so that I could draw on it and change things around. But then you also had PowerPoint slides. We actually don't really use PowerPoint in the training at all, but just to kind of show the agenda of the day and then any offline activities that they needed to do. And then you have mural boards for the different activities. So it was also just about using all those different platforms that sometimes became a bit complicated, popping from one screen to the next. Same with, we had a WhatsApp group for communication and monitoring that while you're presenting, while you're flicking through the manuals. It took a bit of practice, but it was possible. But simplification, I think, is a nice thing.
And before, some of you, I can't remember, one of you touched upon the assessment. Kelly, you talked about the assessment of the skills. When it comes to a manualized training where people get a certificate, how did you do the assessment of their level of acquiring the skills and being able to transfer them into practice? And that's an open question to whoever wants to answer it.
I can start us off on it,
Yeah.
and then I'll let my colleagues jump in. So we had a parallel process going on, and one that I won't get too much into, but it was with the ENACT assessment and equip folks. So that was a side process that I won't take us down that rabbit hole right now. But in general for PM Plus, this is where the manual is really clever and takes a lot of the guesswork out for you, and it sets out key competencies that you're looking for. And so it's all just in the back of your trainer's manual that, you know, these are certain things you're looking for to ensure that people can demonstrate basic helping skills. These are certain things that you want to look for to make sure that the managing problem strategy is going the right way. So it's all kind of there. And so as trainers, you have that in the back of your head. And then you spend a lot of time just observing. So not just the role plays, but also how people are talking about the interventions and the strategies. You know, and just kind of collecting all of those different data points to sort of see where people are at. And I think this is one of the things that I was most concerned about going into this, was if you can do that online. And I think in a lot of ways you can. And so, you know, the way that PM Plus has things laid out for competencies, it's kind of a rating scale. And you check, you know, how people are doing. And so we just kind of, as trainers, you kind of always have that in the back of your mind. And then of course, if there's any concerns along the way, you check in with folks so that it's not just like, surprise, you didn't complete your training because you didn't show the skills. So, you know, as trainers, we'll have conversations with people, and usually it's incredibly helpful as well, because if they're struggling, if you're noticing maybe they're not really connecting with some of the material, a lot of times there's something else going on, or there's something that they're just not connecting or understanding. So having that space to do the little check-ins throughout.
Yeah. I have a question, but before I answer it, maybe it's the same you have, Viviana. So would you jump in, please, Viviana? Ask your question, please.
I just wanted to ask how does that pan out when we're talking about training of trainers? So would you go online because I mean, I don't have an answer. Would you go completely online with a training of trainer, and how would you then assess how they transmit their competencies and how they transmit knowledge?
I think this is what we're trying to answer right now for PM Plus, where, you know, we're thinking about it, developing a training of trainers, which will take a lot of accompanying materials to make sure that they can then transfer their knowledge. But my answer is, I don't think we know. I think we're hopeful, and I think we want to try. But Michelle, Sarah, and others jump in. But I think it's still, we're exploring this. But Ia and others, I think you've had experiences with other modalities, training of trainers. So.
Yeah, but let's turn to you first. Sarah, you have raised your hand. Would you go? Sarah Harrison,
Yeah, there's
please.
just 2 points. So in answer to your question, Viviana, I think it depends upon whether you're training someone to do an online training themselves, or whether you're going to train someone to do a face-to-face training and you are doing a TOT remotely. Because I think that is the advantage is if you do a remote training and the person's then also going to deliver an online training in whatever topic, then one potential advantage is you can sit in when they do that training as an observer, maybe with your camera off, and observe how they're doing as a trainer in their subsequent trainings to check competencies. So there is that advantage to it. I still am struggling personally in getting my head around doing an online TOT for someone who is then going to also facilitate online. I think that's very, very challenging, and I can't get my head around it, which makes me think I'm not fully convinced either that it's possible. But yeah, and I think for it would make Problem Management Plus, which is already 80 hours worth of training or capacity building, longer. And then what can you meaningfully ask someone to do as a participant? I mean, you're probably looking at 3 weeks worth of a training then. Yeah. Kind of 15 days or 13 days, and that's just too much. Or you have to massively spread it out over a longer period of time. So you couldn't do it consecutive days. Yeah, and then on the other point, coming back in terms of the documentation, I think the other advantage is that with the offline work that participants had, so in the SOS training, they had about 2.5 hours of offline work a day. It is like homework. I mean, they actually submitted answers to questions and reflections that they were asked to do, and they were uploading them into the Google Drive that we had, a shared folder that we had. And then as a trainer, I was going through and reviewing them, marking without marking. There's no red marks but you're then reviewing it before the training starts that day. And that meant that I could also check, okay, who is not grasping this concept theoretically? And it comes a bit clearer because they're not able to do it in the training as well. So the offline work is an easy way of checking theoretical knowledge or grasping of something.
There was one more question, and that's about the supervision. So after the training in the PM Plus, there's also a supervision aspect. So it's not only the 10 days, then you go on. So just briefly take us through that, will you? And what are the challenges in that when it comes to online? Michelle, could I then ask you to elaborate on that?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that, because that was actually the point that I wanted to raise in terms of competency assessments is following the training. It's not that people automatically kind of get certified to be PM Plus helpers. They then have to go through a supervision process. And that was actually quite an interesting thing to do remote. But then to be fair, we've done face-to-face trainings where we've had to do supervision remotely anyway, because people were coming from different parts of the world. So it wasn't all that different. I think, in terms of the main challenges that you have there is usually when you do in-person supervision, you would like to actually supervise people during session. And obviously you can't necessarily do that remotely. So you're relying on a lot of case presentations and discussions that you're having with participants. But another thing that I like to use a lot is role plays. So when people start presenting and they say, I got stuck on this point, we'll say, okay, let's practice it. Let's do it as a group. And then everybody chips in. That's the other thing, the supervision happens in group. And that's a really important thing because people can really learn from one another. And now we're currently doing supervision with one of our cohorts. We've started to mix contexts as well, so people can start to learn from different countries' experiences. And that's proved to be quite rich as well.
Sounds like a really rich experience, as you're saying. And we'd also like to show you an example of how we, in the other trainings that we've done, how we map what people are learning. So Shona, would you be so kind to show us that? Yes. So when, sorry, you will take us through. Thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Iya. So essentially, this is like just one activity design, and this was a very complex activity on triage, and Viviana and Virle were a part of that, and they like can talk a little bit about it. But here, what we had designed is initially when we were trying to lay out the activity, we were trying to see what are the different technologies that people interact with and what stages they do that. And it also provides like a way that we can explain to participants, because since it is online, it's already confusing for us to see it. To have something visual that allows people to see how they're moving throughout the process really helps. So for example, the first thing that we start off with is, as you can see, the actors on the site, which the volunteers, observers, and family passengers. And and then you kind of take each of them and move through the entire process. So it's like the family member goes to the main room and they go maybe into the first Zoom breakout room or second Zoom breakout room. So this was just an interactive way of showing people what is going to happen in the process. And the important thing about this is you're also thinking about the skills that each set of people are learning in this particular flowchart. So I'm going to show you the mapping of the skills and the competencies. Here, what we've done is trying to analyze case by case. In this part, what is the learning experience happening? Or say here, when you're just getting into your character and dressing up a bit, you're trying to create engagement and empathy. The same goes for trying to organize and then getting more technology skills. So once you are able to map these out step by step on like a flow chart, you'll have a better idea of A, what you're assessing, and B, what is the movement of the participants. If you're using different technologies like breakout rooms, or you're trying to communicate through WhatsApp, so you know what is the purpose of each of them. And also by sharing this, you're sort of instructing them in a more detailed way, because we found that instructions become a major part when you're doing these sessions. It's not a table, it's not a physical space wherein people can just be like, I have a question, so why don't you come to my table and answer that question? That's not going to happen. So we had like a multiple communication technologies to kind of build that out. So I wonder if anyone has a little bit of questions here before we go over to really understanding how we're looking at the different technologies.
I'd like to add that as there were questions on how to assess the competencies, then this is held up against if we have, for instance, a training for a given national society, meaning that it's just participants from that national society, then it's held up against the competencies that are described in the competency framework that then they themselves assess and the facilitators assess. And then in the end, we actually have a one-to-one meeting with each participant on whether they have achieved and where they think they are, at what level is it, are they level 1, 2, or 3? So it's quite structured as well, even though it's not manualized in that way. Verle and Viviana, any comments from having tried these complicated exercises?
I think it was very clear because of the guidance given by Shauna and everything else. So I think this is very important. And what we notice sometimes is that sometimes the introduction went a bit fast. So really taking the time to ask participants, is everything clear? And before sending them out to the breakout rooms, because then of course the chance to go over the guidance is very limited. But it was very interesting, and especially the reflection then afterwards, which is of course also in a face-to-face training. But it still worked very well also online. So it was a good experience from my side.
Yeah, I agree. I think it worked remarkably well. I have to say I was a bit skeptical before going into it, but I think it worked really, really well. And I was amazed how I ended up being an observer, I remember, and I was really, really impressed about how people were able to like use the screen and try and really tried hard in those little scenarios, and we actually replicated it during an online training on the use of Zoom, etc., with some of our branches in the Caribbean. It went quite well, I have to say, and it wasn't as, you know, sophisticated as the one that you had us doing us, but I really enjoyed it and use it as a tool. I was surprised about how good it worked.
That's really nice to hear. And let's focus more on the tools. Shauna, do you want to talk about the tools and yeah, please.
So this was just like a maybe infrastructure or framework that you can think about, as like we had a lot of these trainings and we tried to put it in a framework. We were thinking about what are the different tools and what is the need for those tools that you're trying to use. So the first one is a hosting platform. And know that the tools that we use through the training are not the only tools out there. You can definitely use more. For hosting, we looked at what are the event platforms that can give us small group discussions as well as large group discussions, and kind of have access and the facilitators being able to navigate those small group discussions in order to give guidance to other people. Additionally, two important things that you might want to remember here is to create private channels. So maybe a private breakout group for if at any point of time, because this is an MHPSS training, you need participants to step out. And if you want to give them a counseling session or have additional challenge for facilitators to coordinate among themselves. And then that was, so the channel that we use here was Zoom. And then we move on to the information exchange, which was more cloud-based. So you need either maybe a Google Drive, or I know we used Microsoft Teams also because we transitioned to that for more confidential information and maintaining confidentiality to different things, and a more organized file systems with scheduling and project management facilities. So that was also something that we incorporated as we went throughout the process. Then interactive tools, we use Mural. So it's essentially a collaborative platform. At any point of time, you essentially think of a table or a chart paper, which you can collaborate on, and think of that, what are the different places that is available digitally. And it could also be a game platform where there are a lot of instances of trainings where people have actually used games and role-playing games. So they engage on that platform and then they conduct their trainings. For communication, we had a formal channel and then we had an informal channel, because we realized that we need a formal channel for information to be more specific and detailed, and then an informal one or a direct messaging platform to look at text or fuss and for more community building purposes. And then finally, we had like a building support mechanisms, which was anonymous ways of telling your facilitators how the training is going and if you need any help, and creating those communications in place so that people could engage directly and not have to, if they don't want to say anything on the public forum. But in general, maybe at the end, just tying up the whole thing in terms of the technology learning curve, yeah, Michelle and Kelly, what are your thoughts on the process?
Kelly, would you go first? And then I would like to end with the closing remarks after Michelle. Sarah had to leave, I'm sorry, because it's time for us to close soon.
I think my reflection is maybe not the one you hope to hear, but for me, less is more. And I find this more and more with the different contexts that we work with as well. The less flashy and buzzy and moving parts, the easier it is to ensure that everybody can participate in the same kind of way. So I really love the different things that we've learned to use. And so the fun part now is figuring out how to simplify and make things just as easy as they can be for people to use.
Yeah, I was actually going to say the same thing. I think just zeroing in on one or two platforms and making those your stars and learning them well. Because I noticed there's still functions on Zoom where I'm like, wow, you can do that. I never knew. So just really learning those things really well before you start exploring too many different things, because otherwise it can become very complicated.
And I'd like to close this session with a thank you to all of you. And it's been great to have you participating. And from my side, I really like, personally, I really like to be engaged and to be there and to be active. And I think that nothing can never, ever stand instead of human contact. And we can also do that online. So that would be my closing remark, even though technology is wonderful, and having somebody like Shona to help us shine a light on that, but it still takes us to be real people, to be real engaging with others. And that should be the end of the series of how to do online training in MHPSS, because this is what MHPSS is all about, being human.